Well, thank you very much. The bookstall does have one of my books. It unfortunately doesn't have the C.S. Lewis versus the New Atheist book, which is the most recent one. But my previous book on popular defences of atheism, called A Skeptic's Guide to Atheism, is on the bookstall at the back. So there's the blatant self-plugging out of the way, and now we can turn our thoughts to higher matters. So can science solve every mystery? I'm going to be taking a position that says, no, it can't, and indeed we need philosophy as well as science, and indeed I'm going to be defending the position that there are particularly religious forms of knowledge to boot. So that's the position that I'm staking out in this sort of three-way disagreement that we have to lay before you today. I thought I'd start and end with Thomas Aquinas, who of course called theology the queen of the sciences, assisted by her handmaiden, philosophy. Of course, back then, the area of study that we now call science was called natural philosophy. And the Latin word scientia, from which we get our word science, simply meant knowledge, or a field of knowledge. So that's a bit of the sort of linguistic background to our conversation, if you like. As Stephen said, I'm both a philosopher and a Christian, so I sort of say a word of definition about those two things. A Christian, to summarize, I put it like this: a Christian is someone who's dedicated to a Jesus-centered and directed spirituality. A spirituality or way of life, where, to put it briefly, a spirituality has to do with the integration of your head, your heart, and your hands, as it were. How you think, what you commit yourself to and will and choose, and what you do in the world as a consequence. Christians, of course, fill out that generic structure of spirituality in a particular way. And Jesus recommended that true spirituality meant loving God with all of your heart, attitudes, all of your mind, including your worldview, all of your strength, your actions, and loving your neighbour as yourself. But even more than that, he taught that entering into what he conceived of as true spirituality meant trusting him, trusting Jesus, as the divine point of access into loving relationship with God. So just a couple of quotes from the New Testament here. Jesus talking about, "Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, and you'll find rest for your souls." Or from John's Gospel, "I am the gate. Whoever enters through me, enters into relationship with God through me, will be saved. I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." So if a Christian is someone dedicated to a Jesus-centered and directed spirituality, what about being a philosopher? Well, philosophers love definitions, so here's another one. A philosopher, I think, is someone who's dedicated to the wise pursuit and dissemination of true answers to significant, especially very fundamental questions through the practice of good intellectual habits. Now, some people will think that those two definitions mean that you couldn't be both. Of course, I happen to think that they can comfortably coincide. And you'll notice, given those two definitions, that knowledge is actually a central concern of both Christianity and philosophy. Now, the standard philosophical definition of knowledge is something like warranted or justified true belief. And philosophers spend a lot of time arguing about this, of course, especially the nature of warrant, and even, indeed, the necessity, as opposed to the desirability of warrant for having knowledge. But to ask how we do or how we should go about knowing things in the world is to engage in the philosophical discipline of epistemology. So with that background in mind, I think I can kind of tee up the question before us this morning. I think it's this: should our epistemology, our theory of knowledge, should it encompass science alone, or science and philosophy, or science and philosophy and theology, as the Queen of Sciences, as it were. That is, we ask, A, is scientism true? And B, are there specifically religious forms of knowledge or not? My answer is going to be that A, scientism is false, and that B, there are specifically religious forms of knowledge. Now, whereas science is a first-order inquiry aimed at obtaining systematic knowledge of physical reality, scientism is a second-order philosophical theory attributing exclusive competency over knowledge to scientific methods. And nothing I say here against scientism should, of course, be construed as an attack upon science. But I'm with the philosopher of science Del Ratch, who I quote here, who says that science cannot validate either scientific method itself or the presuppositions, the philosophical presuppositions of that method. Those who claim either that science is competent for dealing with all matters, or that science is the only legitimate method for dealing with any matter, are seriously confused. Well, Victor Stenger, a physicist, one of the New Atheist writers, bridles at this really and says critics accuse New Atheism of scientism, which is the principle that science is the only means that can be used to learn about the world and humanity. They cannot quote a single New Atheist who said that. Well, what would you make of a writer who issued the following statements? That faith is belief in the absence of supportive evidence. That science is belief in the presence of supportive evidence. And that science does not require, nor does it use, any metaphysics. It would seem to me that someone who says these kind of things qualifies as someone who is enunciating a scientistic position. Of course, all these quotes come from Victor Stenger in his book, The New Atheism. Or Peter Atkins, who'll be on stage momentarily, in his very readable book, On Being. He says, the scientific method is the only means of discovering the nature of reality, the only way of acquiring reliable knowledge. Which leads to the position enunciated by Stephen Hawking and Leonard Mlodinow in their book, The Grand Design, where they say at the beginning, philosophy is dead. Philosophy is not kept up with modern developments in science, particularly physics, so that scientists have become the bearers of the torch of discovery in our quest for knowledge. As Professor George Ellis, the president of the International Society for Science and Religion, replied in the Times to Hawking, he said, philosophy is not dead. Every point of view is imbued with philosophy. Why is science worth doing? The answer is philosophical. Science can't answer that question about itself. Or let's look at one test case of scientism in a little bit more length, Richard Dawkins. According to Dawkins, all beliefs fall into one of two categories. On the one hand, there is what he calls proper evidence-based belief. As he says in his book, The Magic of Reality, the only good reason to believe that something exists is if there is real evidence that it does. It always comes back to our senses, one way or another. So by evidence, he means empirical evidence that ultimately is grounded in our immediate sensory experience, a very strong form of empiricism as a theory of knowledge. On the other hand, there's the improper methodology of blind faith, as if blind were a redundant qualifier for the term faith. So he says, faith is believing in something when there literally isn't a scrap of evidence. If there were a scrap of evidence, then by definition, it wouldn't be faith, according to Dawkins. Well, I think this is both a serious misunderstanding of faith, as understood at least within the central Christian tradition, and indeed a misunderstanding of the nature of reason and rationality. I'm with the Christian theologian Alistair McGrath, who replies that Dawkins's idiosyncratic definition of faith simply doesn't stand up to investigation. In fact, it is itself an excellent example of a belief tenaciously held and defended in the absence of evidence, even in the teeth of evidence to the contrary. As McGrath says, the classic Christian tradition has always valued rationality and does not hold that faith involves the complete abandonment of reason or believing in the teeth of evidence. Indeed, the Christian tradition is so consistent on this matter, it's hard to understand where Dawkins gets the idea that faith is blind trust rather than trust that one thinks is well-grounded from. As C.S. Lewis put it, I had to quote him, having just written a book about him, he defined faith very succinctly as the art of holding on to things your reason has once accepted in spite of your changing moods. So, I would say that the self-contradictory, scientistic, philosophical claim that rational belief requires direct or indirect empirical evidence, that claim itself is not a claim that can be justified or warranted by direct or indirect empirical evidence. And that's why it's a self-contradictory claim. And if something is self-contradictory, it cannot be true. Also, the scientistic, philosophical demand that every rational belief must be justified by empirical evidence entails an infinite regress that cannot be satisfied. If you said, well, I'm not going to believe A unless I have some empirical evidence for its truth and its, for justifying my belief in it. So let's go to B, the empirical evidence for A. But of course, I shouldn't believe that B is indeed empirical evidence for A, as it appears to be, unless I had some empirical evidence for that, and call it C. But of course, I shouldn't believe that C, as it appears to be, is empirical evidence for B, and that it really supports it, and so on, unless I have some evidence for that claim. And you're just digging yourself further and further into the pit of complete skepticism about everything. In that sense, as I say at the bottom there, scientism is a deeply anti-scientific viewpoint to hold. If you really held to it, you wouldn't be able to do science because the whole project wouldn't be able to get off the ground. And thirdly, the scientific philosophical demand that every rational belief must be justified by empirical evidence is, I think, also open to obvious counterexamples, mainly concerning properly basic beliefs, things like these beliefs, which one might well think you would have to believe these things in order to do science, things like the belief that the physical world has an objective existence. Things like the physical world didn't pop into existence 5 minutes ago, complete with misleading empirical indicators of apparent age, such as food in your stomach from meals that you'd never ate, apparent memories in your brains from events that never happened, tree rings in trees from summers where they never grew. But of course, all of the empirical evidence is, by hypothesis, completely consistent with the hypothesis that the world popped into existence 5 minutes ago, complete with apparent signs of age. And yet, are we not all completely rational to believe that the world is older than 5 minutes old? Well, of course we are. That memory is a generally reliable indicator of truth. You couldn't support that belief by doing science. You'd have to remember the results of the experiment as you went through it in order to write it up, in order to support the hypothesis. You have to rely upon memory. You just know that memory is, generally speaking, reliable. Even to know that it has misled you on occasion, you have to rely on it. That laws of logic, such as, say, the law of non-contradiction is true, is something that has to be assumed by science and cannot, of course, be justified by it. Moral truths, indeed, science as a social practice relies upon certain moral standards and so on. That there are moral truths such as, to use a typical philosophical example, it is objectively wrong to torture small children for fun. That is not an empirical observation. Empirically, you could tell if you torture small children for fun, certain consequences happen. But whether or not those consequences or those actions are morally good or bad, that's not something you measure in a test tube or under a microscope. Or aesthetic truths, such as rainbows are beautiful. I think that's true. It's something that obviously doesn't comport with scientism as a theory of knowledge. Indeed, in many scientific fields, particularly sort of cosmological, more mathematical fields of science, scientists will often appeal to beauty as a standard within science for theory choice. As C.S. Lewis put it, you cannot produce rational intuition by argument, because argument depends upon rational intuition. Proof rests upon the unprovable, which just has to be seen. If you try and prove that the law of non-contradiction is true and reliable, any proof you try and produce will, of course, rely upon the law of non-contradiction being true, which is to argue in a circle and beg the question and not to prove your point. But nonetheless, we know that the only rational position is to hold that the law of non-contradiction is true. Here's a more modern writer who seems to agree with Lewis in this matter. And again, I'd like to read you through the quote, and then I will reveal who the quote is from. This writer says that intuition denotes the most basic constituent of our faculty of understanding. While this is true in matters of ethics, it is no less true in science. When we can break our knowledge of a thing down no further, the irreducible leap that remains is intuitively taken. Thus, the traditional opposition between reason and intuition is a false one. Reason is itself intuitive to the core, as any judgment that a proposition is reasonable or logical relies upon intuition to find its feet. The point, I trust, is obvious. We cannot step out of the darkness without taking a first step, and reason, without knowing how, understands this axiom if it would understand anything at all. The reliance on intuition, therefore, should be no more discomforting for the ethicist than it has been for the physicist, says Sam Harris, atheist writer. So there he seems to abandon a theory of knowledge, or the scientistic theory, which elsewhere he will appeal to in order to sort of use as a stick to beat those religious people such as myself. Indeed, in his book, The Moral Landscape, subtitled How Science Can Determine Human Values, he explicitly contradicts his main thesis of the book and the scientistic theory of knowledge that lies behind it. He says this: science cannot tell us why, scientifically, we should value well-being. The demand for radical justification levelled by the moral skeptic could not be met by science. Science is defined with reference to the goal of understanding the processes at work in the universe. Can we justify this goal scientifically? Of course not. What evidence could prove that we should value evidence? So I am arguing that scientism as a theory of knowledge is false, and consequently philosophy is not, contra Hawking et al., dead. Indeed, I'd say that however detailed our scientific descriptions of physical reality become, such descriptions are by nature incapable of explaining why physical reality has the fundamental structure it has, or why any physical reality described by that structure should exist at all rather than not. That is, science inevitably raises metaphysical questions that require metaphysical answers. Whatever answers you give to those questions raised by science, whether they be metaphysically naturalistic answers or supernaturalistic answers, they are metaphysical rather than scientific answers. And indeed, at this point, and I won't be able to labour this point, but I think it's an important one, I would want to argue that philosophy, and even indeed philosophy in conjunction with premises that are supported by scientific evidence, can warrant a religious worldview. As I say, I can't spend much time defending this, and it's not the central aspect of what we're looking at today. So I'm just going to do a bit of a literature punt. Quote William Lane Craig, who notes that in the last half century that we've witnessed a remarkable resurgence of interest in the field of natural theology or arguments for theism, and agree with Alvin Plantinga, who says that there are a number of reasonably strong arguments for the existence of God. And I put up a few examples of good books to pursue there. At least at an introductory level, my new philosophy textbook, A Faithful Guide to Philosophy, contains many chapters on some of these arguments. At a much more high, non-introductory level, the recent Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology, which is the go-to source at the moment, I would think. But let me come to defending the particular thing that's going to split myself from our last speaker today, I imagine, in our three-way debate, and that is the contention that there are specifically religious forms of knowledge. Take religious experience as a paradigm case here. Someone having a religious experience, I might want to defend the claim that they can have knowledge through that religious experience. Perhaps their knowledge is God has forgiven my sins, or something like this. Now, I don't want to wall off such experiences from science and philosophy in a sort of hermeneutically sealed box of its own. So I've put a number of things around here. You can see science and philosophy might be thought to establish a worldview context that takes religious experiences seriously. Such that it's not the mere fact that you're having a certain subjective experience which in it of itself warrants everything you believe as a religious person. It might well be that you think you have a background, scientifically and philosophically speaking, that makes taking one's religious experience seriously a plausible thing to do. Science and philosophy might well study the nature and content of religious experiences, and we do all sorts of interesting MRI scan studies of nuns in prayer and how it changes your brain when you adopt certain religious practices and so on. Philosophy might be thought to establish the properly basic rationality of trusting one's religious experiences in the absence of a sufficient defeater for those experiences. Something that Alvin Plantinga, who I just mentioned, has put a lot of time into enunciating a Christian philosophy of properly basic belief. And finally, science and philosophy together might be thought to be able to use the existence, the content, perhaps the effects of religious experiences to warrant a religious worldview. Those experiences can feature in arguments for God, even if one is justified in, say, believing in God absent an argument based upon one's religious experience, or you think one is justified in trusting that experience in a context that one would defend not by mentioning the experience, but by mentioning various philosophical factors. Let me end with 3 examples of independently verified religious knowledge. First of all, it's from the Christian philosopher J.P. Moreland, a philosopher who's done a lot of good writing on particularly the philosophy of mind. He's an American philosopher, but also a Christian towards, shall we say, the slightly more charismatic end of the Christian scale. And I think this is quite an interesting report from him. He was speaking at a conference for Korean Americans, and Moreland asked God if there was anything he should say to the students. And Moreland says that by way of a series of thoughts and images that came to me, he came to believe that God wanted him to say the following. There's a young man here named Mike, and he had a confrontation with his pastor before he came here, and he's continued to blame himself for that confrontation. But it wasn't his fault, it was his pastor's fault, and he needs to share with his pastor how much he was hurt by the confrontation. Now, Moreland says he was a bit worried by the fact that he'd never met a Korean American named Mike. This gave him pause as to whether this was just his own subjective impression, but he says he felt 70-30 that it was from the Lord, and so he shared the word with the group and left for the evening. When he came back the next morning, the conference leader introduced Moreland to the only Mike at the conference who had been inappropriately blaming himself for a confrontation he'd just had with his pastor, who'd said some upsetting and untrue things about Mike and his girlfriend and their relationship, I think. The pastor, indeed, was arriving at the conference later that day, and Mike resolved to speak with him. At least prima facie, one would say, it seemed that Moreland had what Christians would call a word of knowledge. He had a religious experience. It was a falsifiable, verifiable claim to knowledge. He put it out there, and it did indeed seem to be verified. A more biblical example, as it were, this historian Ian Wilson notes that it's a straightforward fact of history that Herod's seemingly so permanent temple, which Jesus had predicted would be destroyed within a generation of his time, and we've got references there across the Synoptic Gospels, did indeed suffer this very fate. So Jesus seems to have made a prediction about what would happen to the temple, and that prediction was empirically verified. Indeed, you can see a photo there of some of the stones from the temple that were cast down when the Romans destroyed it in AD 70. All of the gold and so on in the temple, they set fire to it, and the gold melted and ran amongst the stones, and the Roman soldiers had to leave all of the stones apart to get all the loot, as it were. That's just one sort of dipping of toe into the so-called area of fulfilled prophecy that I've got a whole chapter of in my book, Understanding Jesus. And thirdly, I thought I'd begin and end with Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas famously distinguished between truths known by unaided human reason and truths known by faith, that is, trust in divine revelation. But I want to note about this distinction that unaided human reason might be thought to warrant the acceptance of certain religious beliefs, such as the existence of God. Of course, Aquinas gave his famous 5 ways and so on. But also that it might be thought to warrant trust in the purported revelation. So it's not necessarily that one goes, well, there are certain things I can know by reason, such as I think I know by reason there's a God, and I'm just going to trust this holy book for no reason at all. One needn't, indeed, I think, should not do that. So as William Carroll explains, Aquinas thought that it was a matter of biblical revelation that the world is not eternal. He also thought that reason alone, unaided human reason, without the data of revelation, could not conclude whether the world had a temporal beginning. But even if the universe were not to have had a temporal beginning, it would still depend on God for its existence. So note in the 5 ways of Aquinas, he doesn't give the Kalam type cosmological argument that depends upon there being a beginning, temporally speaking, to the universe. But of course, as the atheist cosmologist Alexander Vilenkin said at the conference in celebration of Stephen Hawking's 70th birthday, all the evidence we have says that the universe had a beginning. Aquinas was actually wrong about this. Unaided human reason does seem to have warranted the conclusion that the universe had a finite past. So Thomas Aquinas knew that the universe had a beginning because he trusted the testimony of divine revelation. So to conclude, scientism is false and philosophy is not dead. I think that philosophy can warrant a religious worldview and certainly should feature in our understanding, interpretation of, trust in any particular revelation claim. And finally, I think that there are specifically religious forms of knowledge, although they're not hermeneutically sealed off from other ways of knowing, that these specifically religious forms of knowledge are instances of warranted or properly basic trust that are distinguished by the religious nature of the object of trust. That is, they are trust in religious experiences or claims of divine revelation. They're not sort of sui generis kinds of knowledge, as it were, but they are nonetheless specifically religious forms of knowledge. Thank you very much for your attention, ladies and gentlemen.